The note said, "Don't open this unless you're ready to lose everything." At first, I thought it was a joke. Not because the message was funny, because my parents had always preferred guilt over threats. I stood on my front porch at exactly 9:47 p.m., holding a box wrapped in plain brown paper. No return address, no postage. Whoever left it had walked it right up to my front door. The paper itself stopped me. My mother always wrapped gifts the same way: plain brown paper, folded with impossibly sharp corners, sealed with clear tape she somehow managed to make completely invisible. She used to say bows were for people trying too hard. I'd know that wrapping anywhere. A light rain had started falling, leaving tiny dark spots across the paper. I remember standing there far longer than I should have, staring at the handwriting on the note. It looked like my father's. Short and deliberate. Almost mechanical. I looked through the glass panel beside my front door, half expecting to see a car pulling away. Nothing. Just an empty street. A flickering porch light across the road. And the uncomfortable feeling that someone had been watching me long enough to know exactly when I'd come home. My 7-year-old son, Ethan, had finally fallen asleep after insisting monsters couldn't get him if the hallway light stayed on. I almost left the box by the door. I actually picked it up to carry it into the garage, thinking, whatever this is can wait until morning. But then my eyes landed on the note again. Don't open this unless you're ready to lose everything. Lose everything? Who writes something like that? Especially your own parents. My name is Rachel Coleman, and this is the night my entire life came apart and somehow, eventually, came back together in a shape I never expected. I almost didn't open the box. My husband had passed 2 years earlier, my son Ethan was 7 and asleep upstairs, and my parents Diane and Richard were people I hadn't spoken to in over a year. We weren't estranged in some dramatic, slammed door way. We just stopped. After they tried to insert themselves into my marriage, my pregnancy, my parenting, I finally said the 4 words every controlling parent hates most. I need some space. Apparently, some space translated, in my mother's mind, to, please continue watching me from a distance, just more quietly. I peeled back the paper. It made that dry, crackling sound packing tape makes when it's been pressed down too hard. For one ridiculous second, I actually wondered if opening it would trigger something. A die pack, a prank, anything except what was actually inside. The lid lifted easier than I expected. Sitting on top was a small black GPS tracker. I frowned. At first I genuinely didn't understand what I was looking at. I turned it over in my hand. There was a strip of dried adhesive on the back, meaning it had already been attached to something. My stomach tightened. Underneath it sat a stack of photographs. The first one was me unlocking my front door. The second, walking Ethan to school. The third, loading groceries into my car. Each photo was taken from a different angle. Different days, different clothes, different weather. But the same unmistakable feeling crawled over me as I flipped through them. Whoever took these wasn't passing by. They were waiting, watching, learning my routine. By the 10th photograph, my hands had started shaking. Not the kind you can hide by putting them in your pockets. The kind that makes your fingertips feel cold before your brain has fully accepted you're in danger. Inside was a small GPS tracker, the kind you'd slap on a rental car you don't trust your teenager with. And under the photos, a manila folder. Legal documents. My name on them. Phrases like unfit environment and concern for the minor child's welfare. That's when my hands started shaking. Not the polite kind of shaking. The kind where you suddenly understand, on a cellular level, that the ground under you was never as solid as you thought. I called 911. I remember trying to keep my voice calm because Ethan was upstairs, and there's a very specific tone you learn as a parent, the everything's fine, sweetie, go back to sleep voice, even when everything is, in fact, extremely not fine. While I waited for the police, I sat on my kitchen floor with that folder in my lap, and my brain did the thing brains do. In crisis it went backward. Way backward. Growing up, my parents didn't yell. They didn't hit. If you'd asked anyone in our neighborhood, they'd have told you Diane and Richard Coleman were the nicest, most involved parents on the block. And they were involved. In everything. My friendships vetted. My report cards audited like tax returns. Looking back now, there were always little things I never questioned. My mother hated talking about the day I was born. Whenever people asked what I was like as a baby, she'd smile, change the subject, or tell a story about my first birthday instead. I thought everyone had blank spots in family history. My first boyfriend lasted exactly 9 days before my mother happened to run into his mother at church and mention some concerns. By the time I met my husband, David, I thought I'd finally built a life with a door that locked from the inside. Then my parents started showing up at our apartment just to help, rearranging our kitchen, questioning our finances, once, and I want you to really sit with this, asking my OBGYN directly whether my pregnancy was high risk enough to require additional oversight. From them, not from doctors, from my mother. That's when David and I drew the line. And that's when the calls stopped. And apparently, the surveillance started. Detective Mark Simmons arrived about 20 minutes after my call. Mid-40s, the calm energy of a man who has seen every version of You Won't Believe This, and stopped being surprised somewhere around year 8 of the job. He looked through the box, snapped on gloves like he was about to handle evidence from a much bigger case than a wrapped box on a suburban porch, and said the sentence that changed the whole shape of the night. Mrs. Coleman, this isn't a one-time thing. This is a pattern. Someone planned this. I laughed not because it was funny, but because my brain simply refused the alternative. Detective, these are my parents, not a cartel. He held up one of the photos. Time-stamped. Multiple angles. Multiple days. Cartels, he said, usually have better funding. This just takes patience. And, apparently, yours have plenty of it. Fair point, detective. Fair point. After he left with the box logged as evidence, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. It looked the same, smelled the same, but something invisible had changed. Every hallway suddenly felt occupied. Every window felt like an eye. I locked the front door, then locked it again. I walked through every room in silence. The living room, nothing. Kitchen, nothing. Laundry room, nothing. I even checked inside the coat closet, feeling completely ridiculous. Then I stopped in the hallway outside Ethan's bedroom. Something wasn't right, the smoke detector. It hung just slightly crooked, barely noticeable. Except, I'd walked past it thousands of times. I would have noticed. I dragged a dining chair into the hallway. My hands shook so badly climbing onto it that I nearly slipped. When I twisted the detector loose, I heard something move inside. Not the light plastic rattle of batteries. Something heavier. I pulled the cover away. There it was. A tiny camera. The lens, no bigger than the head of a nail. I don't think I've ever felt violated in quite that way before. Someone hadn't just watched my house, they'd watched us. Ethan sleeping, me pacing the hallway after nightmares, movie nights, birthdays, ordinary moments that belonged only to us. Suddenly they didn't anymore. That's the moment I realized. This wasn't about curiosity, it was about control. If you're new here, welcome. I tell true-to-life stories about family, betrayal, and the messy business of finding out who people really are. If that sounds like your thing, hit subscribe now because trust me, you do not want to miss where this one goes. I now remembered, during my parents' last surprise visit, 3 weeks earlier, when my mother insisted our old one was a fire hazard and Richard just happened to have a replacement in the car. Nothing says I love and trust my daughter quite like installing a covert camera disguised as basic fire safety equipment. Truly, the Nobel Committee should look into a new category. I barely slept. Around 3 in the morning, Ethan padded into my bedroom carrying his dinosaur blanket. He climbed onto the bed beside me. Mom? Yeah, buddy? Are the police gone? I nodded. They're gone. He was quiet for a moment. Then, are we moving? The question caught me completely off guard. Why would you think we're moving? He shrugged. Because that's what kids do in movies when bad people know where they live. I smiled. Or at least I tried to. No. I wrapped my arm around him. We're staying right here. He seemed satisfied. Within minutes, he was asleep against my shoulder. I stayed awake until sunrise, because unlike Ethan, I wasn't sure I'd just told him the truth. By morning, I assumed the worst was behind me. I was wrong in a way that would have made for a great plot twist if it wasn't, my actual life. At 8:15 a.m., I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a court clerk informing me that Diane and Richard Coleman had filed an emergency custody petition for Ethan, my son, claiming, in writing, that I was mentally unstable and that my home posed an active risk to his welfare. I actually sat down, on the floor, phone still pressed to my ear, because my legs simply declined to hold the weight of that sentence. That afternoon, I hired an attorney, Vanessa Cole, A sharp, no-nonsense woman who'd built her entire career representing parents against exactly this kind of manufactured custody attack. Within 48 hours, Vanessa had already found something disturbing. My mother had been posing convincingly, apparently as a court-appointed guardian evaluator, calling Ethan's teachers and his pediatrician, asking pointed questions about his behavior, his home life, whether he seemed anxious or neglected. My mother had, essentially, cast herself in a role from a legal drama she was not licensed to perform in. "She's thorough," Vanessa said, unable to hide a note of professional respect buried under her disbelief. Terrifyingly thorough. Here's where the story takes the turn I did not see coming, and honestly, neither did Vanessa. My older brother, Daniel, resurfaced. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly a decade. When I arrived, I didn't recognize him. He's older, gray around the temples. He stands when I walked in. "So," he says softly, "you still wrinkle your nose when you're nervous." I stopped. Only one person besides our parents ever noticed that. Daniel smiles. "I wondered if you'd still do that." There was silence. Then, "I wasn't sure you'd come." Neither was I. He left the family young, cut contact so completely that for years I genuinely didn't know if he was even alive. When Vanessa's investigator tracked him down and he agreed to talk, I expected an apology. I expected an explanation about his own falling out with our parents. I sat across from him, searching his face for the brother I remembered. He looked older than he should have. Not just older, tired, like someone who'd spent years carrying something too heavy to put down. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, I broke the silence. "So," my voice sounded smaller than I expected. "Why now?" I've asked myself that question every day for the last 10 years. He let out a quiet laugh that didn't sound amused. "I always thought there'd be a better time." There wasn't. I frowned. "What changed?" He looked up at me. "The custody petition." I blinked. "What?" "I heard what Mom and Dad were trying to do." "You've been keeping tabs on us?" He shook his head. "No." Another pause. I leaned back. "If you know something, just tell me." Daniel opened his wallet. For a second, I thought he was reaching for money. Instead, he carefully slid an old, folded photograph onto the table. He didn't push it toward me immediately. His fingers stayed resting on it, almost protectively. "I've carried this with me for 12 years. I looked at the photograph. It showed two young women standing outside a church. One of them was unmistakably my mother. The other, I didn't recognize. "Who's she?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he asked, "Do you remember Mom ever talking about her?" I searched my memory. Nothing. "Should I?" "Rachel, I need you to promise me something." I frowned. "What?" "Whatever happens after I tell you this." My patience finally snapped. What are you talking about?" Daniel closes his eyes for a moment, then looks directly at her. I did not expect him to say the sentence that split my entire childhood in two. His voice almost breaks. "Rachel, Mom isn't your biological mother." I actually asked him to repeat it. Twice. Here's the truth, Daniel had been carrying alone for 10 years. My biological mother was a woman named Susan Whitmore, Diane's closest friend growing up. Susan passed away shortly after I was born, and on her deathbed, she'd asked Diane, her most trusted friend in the world, to raise me as her own. Diane said yes. And then Diane did something that, depending on how you look at it, is either deeply loving or deeply damaging. She simply never told me. Ever. She built an entire life around a secret so complete that I never once questioned it. Daniel found out by accident as a teenager an old letter. In it was a paperwork error he wasn't supposed to see. When he confronted our parents, expecting honesty, he got denial. Gaslighting. Mother insisting he'd misunderstood, Richard backing her up to keep the peace. Daniel, still a kid himself, eventually gave up trying to force the truth out and instead just left. Not because our parents were monsters, because he couldn't live inside a lie that big and pretend it wasn't there. Now here's the part that actually explains everything that happened with that box on my porch. Recently, we still don't know exactly how my mother realized I was getting close to the truth myself. An old medical record, a DNA-linked pediatric database flag through Ethan's file, and instead of finally telling me the truth after 30-plus years, my mother did the one thing her fear knew how to do. She panicked, and she pattern-matched straight back to Daniel. Because here's what haunted her when Daniel found out and confronted her. She lost him completely. Not just him. His daughter too, my niece, who I've genuinely never met. In my mother's mind, one truth had already cost her an entire branch of her family, permanently. So when she sensed the same truth creeping toward me, her twisted logic wasn't, let's finally be honest. It was, if Rachel finds out and reacts like Daniel did, I lose her too and I lose Ethan, just like I lost Daniel's daughter. I need legal rights to my grandson now, before that happens, so I can never be shut out again. It's not a good plan. It's not even a legal plan. But it's a plan built entirely out of grief and fear, which somehow makes it both more understandable and more chilling at the same time. And this is where Richard's role finally comes into focus, because up until now, you'd be forgiven for picturing my parents as a single unit, moving in perfect, sinister lockstep. They weren't. Diane was the architect of the fear. Richard was the architect of the plan. For 30 years, Richard's role in that marriage was simple. When Diane spiraled, he managed it, fixed it, smoothed it over, quietly, before it became a bigger problem. So when Diane came to him panicking about losing Ethan the way they'd lost Daniel's daughter, Richard didn't stop her. He organized her. He was the one who installed the smoke detector camera. He tracked my schedule for the GPS logs. He found and paid the person who forged those legal documents. Not because he believed it was right. Vanessa would later get him to admit, under cross-examination, the quietest, most devastating sentence of the entire case. Mr. Coleman, when did you first realize this plan was illegal? There was silence. He looks at Diane, then at Rachel, then says, the day I bought the camera. Another question. Why didn't you stop? There was a longer silence. Then, because after 30 years, I forgot the difference between helping my wife and helping her fear. I knew it was wrong the whole time. I just didn't know how to tell my wife no. That, right there, might be the saddest sentence in this whole story. A man who spent 3 decades being so good at managing his wife's fear that he forgot how to challenge it even when challenging it was the only right thing left to do. The custody hearing happened 5 weeks later. Vanessa laid it all out, methodically, like she was building a house out of everything my parents thought they'd hidden. The GPS logs, the hidden camera footage, the forged documents, time-stamped and cross-referenced. Daniel testified, calmly at first, then, for one brief moment, his voice cracked when he talked about the daughter our parents have never met. The prosecutor, watching the pattern unfold, one child driven away a decade ago, another nearly having her son taken from her now, didn't treat it as an isolated dispute. She treated it as exactly what it was, a repeat offense with new victims. The judge denied the emergency custody petition in full. Full stop. Then came the part I wasn't sure would ever actually happen. The referral for criminal charges. Stalking. Unauthorized surveillance. Forgery. Here's where Richard and Diane's story splits, and honestly, it's the most fitting ending either of them could have written for themselves. Richard, who orchestrated the evidence, the forgery, the surveillance with clear and documented intent, faced the harsher charges the prosecution had no trouble proving premeditation because he was the one who'd left a paper trail a mile long. Diane, whose psychological evaluation revealed the full weight of decades of unresolved grief, unprocessed guilt over Susan's death, and a fear response that had clearly warped into something dangerous, received leniency-mandated treatment, supervised terms, a lighter sentence that acknowledged the difference between calculated cruelty and a broken woman making increasingly desperate, harmful choices. Is that fair? Depends who you ask. I've made my peace with it, mostly. I didn't walk away from all of this hating my mother, which honestly surprised even me. I walked away finally understanding her, and understanding isn't the same as forgiving, but it's a start. What I gained, though, was something I never expected. I reached out to Susan Whitmore's surviving family, an aunt I never knew I had, cousins who'd wondered for years what happened to Susan's baby. My aunt looked at me for a long moment before smiling through her tears. You have Susan's eyes, she whispered. I've spent 33 years wondering if I'd ever see them again. I didn't know what to say. She reached for my hand. Welcome home, Rachel. As I prepare to leave, my aunt hugged me tightly before I walked out. We didn't lose Susan completely, she whispered. A part of her just walked back through our front door. And Daniel, my brother, gone for 10 years, came home. I met my niece for the first time. She's 9. She likes dinosaurs and thinks my son Ethan's jokes are, and I quote, Actually kind of funny for an old person's kid. Which fair. Ethan's 7. I'm right there with you, kid. A few months later, I was putting away Christmas decorations when I found it. The brown wrapping paper. I'd folded it neatly and tucked it into the back of a kitchen drawer without even realizing it. Ethan wandered in. Mom? Yeah? Why do you still have old wrapping paper? I looked down at it for a long moment, then smiled. Because sometimes, I folded it carefully one last time. The scariest gift you'll ever receive ends up giving you the truth you've needed your whole life. He looked confused, then shrugged the way only 7-year-olds can. Can I have hot chocolate? I laughed. A real laugh this time. Yeah, buddy. As he ran toward the kitchen, I looked out the window. For the first time in years, I didn't feel watched, I just felt free. We all sat down for dinner together. Me, Ethan, Daniel, my niece, and a small, patchwork family built not on secrets, but finally, on truth. I joked that I now technically have 2 family group chats, and for the first time in my life, I actually know which one to trust. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this: sometimes the people who claim to be protecting you are the ones you need protection from, and sometimes the truth you're afraid of is actually the thing that finally sets you free. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.